Shalom. Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I'm joined in the studio by Mark Finkelstein, who is the Jewish Community Relations Director of the Jewish Federation of Greater Des Moines. And Mark, we're talking about the soft policy here, soft American foreign policy, or softer American foreign policy. What are your thoughts?
Well, David, you are articulating the fact that American interests and I think world interests lie in promotion of a true democracy, true tolerance of minorities, and things that go along with that, such as the freedom of the press or free judiciary, all the hallmarks that we would consider to be essential in a real democratic government. In contrast to that, we've had over the last 25 years ago, the work of such people like Herbert Marcuse or Noam Chomsky, and especially Edward Said, whose book Orientalism had a major impact on left-wing thought. And that left-wing thought basically says that the United States and Western culture is truly repressive and exploitative of other cultures, and this has really influenced how some people have seen American foreign policy and have wanted to retool it in order to make it come more in line with international needs. Have you come across those ideas?
Well, we come across those ideas all the time. I mean, look, the reality is this. We're in a situation in which we've got growing Islamist role in the Middle East. We are trying to figure out how to move forward with the Muslim Brotherhood running Egypt and the growth of Islamists all over the place. And I think to a certain extent, we're trying to not have a foreign policy that is that hostile to those views.
Not confrontational. Yeah.
And if our foreign policy basically says we can't deal with anybody who's got those views, we don't have anybody we can deal with.
Except for Al-Qaeda, whose views have been segregated as especially egregious.
And so we're running into a situation here in which we don't necessarily want to say we can't deal with you if you have moderately oppressive religious views or even significantly oppressive religious views. We're going to deal with you anyway. But the problem I see here is the United States at some point has to say, look, we'll deal with you on a strategic basis, but we're not going to be happy about it, and we're not going to give you all the benefits of being our best buddy just because we need you this moment. We're not going to say wonderful things about the Turkish government of Erdogan, which we know is god-awful and is promoting all kinds of things that are anti-Western, anti-American, anti-Israel, and anti-liberty, yes. And acting as if we love the guy so that he can turn around and use in his elections the fact that the United States is very supportive and thinks Turkey's a wonderful world leader. I mean, we can't possibly have a policy that does that. And that seems to be what our policy is right now. Let's make these guys who are promoting policies that are anti-American, anti-Western, anti-liberty, and make them feel good about what they're doing and make their people feel good about what they're doing. So they'll like America and think that we're not opposed to who they are.
Well, the two points here. The first is that there's a significant proportion of the American population who would agree with that in contradistinction to George Bush's regime, anything other than Bush is the proper way to go. And there's probably some validity to that, but it depends how far you want to go in order to overturn some bad things that happened in American foreign policy. In other words, the Iraq type of stuff really poisons the well for an objective understanding of current conflicts. Would you agree?
You know, I think there's an issue of people who are war weary, one.
Oh, that's just like after Vietnam.
And we certainly have people who are interested in trying to keep the United States from spending huge amounts of money on military stuff instead of other things that we could be spending money on. But for me, the problem comes in this idea of standing up for your principles. And at some point, you can't just say letting everybody do whatever they want is going to be our primary principle. At some point, the principle has to be we're going to stand up for democracy and what that really means. Democracy does not really mean we want one election and we don't care whatever happens after that. That's not being pro-democracy.
So do you think basically that some people are saying there's two threads here? The first is a reaction to mistakes made in Iraq. And the second reaction is people whose ideology is further to the left to begin with.
Well, what I don't understand is the people with ideology further to the left who are more socially liberal, who are advocating for policies that would allow governments that are oppressive right-wing governments to function, and they're arguing against the United States using its influence to try to help people. How can you and I do a lot of work on Sudan, and we see this in dealing with Sudan advocacy all the time. The United States certainly has policies designed to combat genocide, but we're not using them against Sudan much at all. We've got sanctions against Sudan that we're allowing to be circumvented by promoting, by demanding that South Sudan send oil through Sudan, giving Sudan the income that it needs that it could otherwise get.
There's a difference there, though, David. It seems, if you take a strict left-wing view that the West is inherently exploitative, that's one thing. If perhaps the American administration says with Sudan, we would really like to do this, but our top priority is to prevent Sudan from warring again against South Sudan. How do you understand those things?
Well, what I understand is that we can't have mutually exclusive policies. We actually have to deal with both issues. We have to say we're going to try to prevent war between Sudan and South Sudan, but we can't allow then Sudan to do whatever it wants to its civilian population, killing people, starving them to death, simply because we want to prevent a civil war. That's not okay.
So
this is where we got into isolationist policies after World War I. I tend to think that our position where we are right now is not 1939, like people say. I think we're post-World War I, and we've got this, it's the same mindset. We've got this, we don't want any war. We don't want war at all costs. Let's work with all these people who are actively pursuing war and violence, and we're going to allow them to continue advancing toward the point where they'll be very much more effective at pursuing war and violence, as long as they don't do it right now. And they can oppress their populations internally as much as they want, and as long as they don't do anything that dramatically affects the supply of oil, we're not going to care.
Okay.
I mean, that seems to be what Europe and the United States policy is right now, dealing with much of the world, and it's not okay. I'm not even sure that President Obama supports that policy. I think it's just where things are. He may
not have the ability to manipulate it to where he wants it to go. The reality is of how do you shift something that has its own forward motion to begin with. Leaving that aside for a second, we have the note here that Iran celebrates limited victory after latest P5+1 talks. In other words, whatever happens during those talks, there's a quote. It says, after 8 months of resistance by the people of Iran against excessive Western demands, finally the P5+1 agreed to negotiate within the framework of Iran's recommendation in Moscow. This is a major step in the negotiation process for the people of Iran. And that it's being used as a propaganda tool.
Well, look, I think that any negotiations are helpful to Iran right now, because the one thing Iran doesn't want to do is stop what it's doing. So as long as it can continue to talk, that's a benefit for Iran. If it gets any concessions at all, that's a major benefit from Iran. And what seems to happen is, as long as there's no reasonable threat of violence being used, that Iran
the forward motion will continue.
Iran can press. The more people argue that there's no military option, the less effective diplomatic pressure and economic pressure are going to be. And we're in a position right now where it's very clear that the anti-war feelings, not just war, the anti-military anything feelings are so strong that there's no credibility in the threats, or limited credibility in the threats of military action. And if all you can do is say, okay, you can have the Sudetenland as long as you give us peace, guess what? There's going to be one after the other, after the other, after the other, and pretty soon you got Poland and the rest of Europe. That's a problem. We can't put ourselves in that situation.
Okay, so the first thing is that through Secretary of State Kerry, we know that the United States is simply beginning its diplomatic effort with Iran, as opposed to what Hillary Clinton said, that there's a time limit.
Well, I don't know that that's true, Mark, because there have been a lot of reports lately that in fact that there's a belief right now that the administration is going to talk to Israel, the Palestinian Authority, and Jordan potentially about the fact that there may be military action coming up. Some of it may have to do with Syria, some of it may have to do with Iran, and that the summer time frame, June, July, may be when action is going to take place. That may be to ramp up that military threat that I just said was
to put it on the table. So, yeah.
Because you got to have that credible military threat in order for any of this other stuff to work. What you don't want is to have Iran call your bluff, because if Iran actually does call the bluff, then you really have no choice but to do military action. And you don't want to go there.
Right. Right.
The idea that you could not do military action at that point. And I think a lot of the pacifist community doesn't really understand this. If you don't do military action at that point, there's going to be a floodgate of violent action, aggressive military action throughout the world, with the understanding that the United States is not going to act against a major threat against the United States. For sure, it's not going to act against a minor threat against the United States. And even more so, it's for sure not going to act in defense of other communities and populations around the world. So if you're a minority person in any nation around the world, you better watch out if the United States is no military credible threat.
Because you're next.
Because you're next.
Yeah.
And so, this is going to be a recurring theme on our show as we move forward in the weeks ahead. We're going to have to wrap up for this week. This weekend is the American-Israel Public Affairs Policy Conference in Washington, D.C. There will be a lot of things that will develop at that conference, certainly a lot more information about Syria and Iran and Israeli coalitions and any number of other things. And so next week, Mark and I will have quite a bit to discuss, just based on what happened in the Israeli policy, in the AIPAC policy conference, and what's going on in foreign policy in the Middle East in general. Thank you for joining us today on Understanding the World. Thank you once again to Dr. Ronald Bergman and Bergman Cosmetic Surgery and Spa, Bergman Folkers Cosmetic Surgery and Spa, for their sponsorship of the show. Thank you. Have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you next week.